Hi guys! Imagine for a moment that you could travel back in time to ancient Rome around the year 100 AD during the height of the empire. You're standing in a bustling Roman city, watching as perfectly organized columns of soldiers march past in their gleaming armor, their synchronized footsteps echoing off the stone buildings. These are the legendary Roman legionaries, the backbone of an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Africa, from Spain to the rivers of Germany. You might think to yourself, how hard could it really be to join their ranks? After all, you've probably done some hiking, maybe hit the gym a few times a week, and you consider yourself reasonably tough. But here's the reality that might shock you. The average modern person, despite all our technological advantages and comfortable lifestyles, would struggle immensely to survive even a single day as a Roman legionary. The life of a Roman soldier was so fundamentally different from anything we experience today that it would be like stepping into an entirely alien world. We're talking about men who could march 25 miles in full armor while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, then spend the evening building a fortified camp from scratch, all on a diet that would make a modern nutritionist weep. These weren't just warriors, they were engineers, construction workers, diplomats, and administrators all rolled into one incredibly disciplined package. Over the next few hours, we're going to dive deep into every aspect of Roman military life, from the grueling recruitment process to the harsh realities of campaign life, from the ingenious engineering projects they completed to the brutal discipline that kept their ranks in line. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something that would eliminate most modern candidates right from the beginning: the recruitment process itself. When we think about joining the military today, we picture recruiters in shopping malls, glossy brochures highlighting education benefits, and maybe a few weeks of basic training before you're assigned to a relatively comfortable base with air conditioning, hot meals, and regular communication with family back home. The Roman approach was completely different, and frankly, most of us wouldn't even qualify for consideration. First, there was the age requirement. You had to be between 17 and 23 years old, which might not sound too restrictive until you realize that the average lifespan in ancient Rome was only about 35 years. This meant you were committing potentially half your entire life to military service, not just a 4-year stint with college benefits waiting at the end. The physical standards were absolutely unforgiving by modern metrics. Roman recruiters didn't just want you to be in decent shape, they demanded physical perfection according to their very specific criteria. You had to be at least 5 feet and 10 inches tall, which was actually quite tall for that era, when the average height was significantly shorter than today. But height was just the beginning of their checklist. They examined your teeth to ensure they were strong enough to tear the tough, dried meat that formed a significant portion of military rations. They checked your eyesight with tests that required identifying objects and people at considerable distances, since you might need to spot enemy movements across vast battlefields without the benefit of binoculars or any optical aids. Your hearing had to be acute enough to distinguish between different horn signals in the chaos of combat, and your voice had to be strong enough to shout commands that could be heard over the din of marching armies and clashing weapons. Even if you passed the physical examination, there was the matter of the military oath, known as the sacramentum, which was far more serious and binding than any modern military commitment. This wasn't just a contract you could break if you decided military life wasn't for you. It was considered a sacred vow that carried both legal and religious implications. Breaking this oath wasn't just desertion in the military sense, it was viewed as a betrayal of the Roman state itself and an offense against the gods. The punishment for oath-breaking could include execution, and even if you survived, you would be marked as a man without honor for the rest of your life, unable to participate in civic life or hold any position of respect in Roman society. The social class considerations were another hurdle that would be completely foreign to modern democratic sensibilities. While the Roman army did eventually become more merit-based than many institutions of its time, your family background still mattered enormously in determining your potential for advancement. If you came from the patrician class, the traditional Roman nobility, you might enter as an officer candidate with a clear path to leadership positions. But if you were from the plebeian class, the common people, you started at the absolute bottom and had to prove yourself through years of exceptional service before you could hope for any meaningful promotion. Even worse, if you were a freed slave or the son of a freed slave, certain positions would remain forever closed to you, regardless of your abilities or achievements. Regional recruitment practices varied significantly across the vast Roman Empire, and where you came from could dramatically affect your military experience. Recruits from the Italian peninsula, particularly those from areas around Rome itself, were often considered the cream of the crop and might find themselves assigned to the most prestigious legions with the best equipment and the most experienced officers. Meanwhile, recruits from newly conquered territories might find themselves in auxiliary units with inferior equipment and more dangerous assignments. Germanic tribes provided excellent cavalry and infantry known for their fierce fighting spirit, but they often faced suspicion from Roman commanders who questioned their ultimate loyalty to the empire. The recruitment process also included a thorough investigation into your character and family history that would make modern background checks look superficial. Roman recruiters wanted to know about your father's military service, your family's reputation in the community, any legal troubles you or your relatives might have encountered, and even your personal habits regarding drinking, gambling, and relationships. They were looking for men who demonstrated the Roman virtues of disciplina, fortitudo, and pietas, discipline, courage, and duty. If you had a reputation for being hot-tempered, unreliable, or disrespectful to authority, you wouldn't make it past the initial screening regardless of your physical capabilities. Perhaps most challenging for modern sensibilities was the expectation that you would completely surrender your individual identity to become part of the military machine. Roman legionaries weren't encouraged to think of themselves as unique individuals with personal goals and aspirations. They were expected to see themselves as interchangeable parts of a larger organism. Your personal preferences, your comfort, your desires, even your safety, were all secondary to the needs of the legion and the glory of Rome. This level of psychological commitment would be almost impossible for someone raised in a culture that emphasizes individual rights and personal fulfillment. The financial aspects of recruitment were also quite different from modern military service. Unlike today's military, which offers signing bonuses, education benefits, and competitive salaries, Roman legionaries received relatively modest pay that was subject to numerous deductions for food, equipment, and various fees. You had to provide some of your own gear initially, which meant that poorer recruits often went into debt just to meet the basic requirements for service. This created a system where military service was simultaneously one of the few paths to social advancement available to common people, while also being financially risky enough that it could destroy a family if the recruit died or was seriously injured before completing his term of service. Once you somehow managed to survive the recruitment process and take the sacred oath, the real ordeal would begin with training that would make modern boot camp look like a relaxing vacation. Roman military training, or tirocinium, was designed not just to teach combat skills, but to completely reshape civilian men into professional soldiers capable of operating as a coordinated unit under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The training period lasted for several months and was deliberately harsh enough to eliminate anyone who lacked the physical and mental toughness required for campaign life. The daily training schedule would begin before dawn with a series of exercises designed to build endurance, strength, and coordination. Roman trainers understood that soldiers needed to be able to function effectively even when exhausted, hungry, and under extreme stress, so they deliberately created training conditions that were more difficult than actual combat situations. Recruits would run long distances while carrying full packs and weapons, not on modern running tracks or paved roads, but across rough terrain that simulated the conditions they would encounter on campaign. These runs weren't leisurely jogs. They were conducted at a pace that would challenge modern marathon runners, and anyone who fell behind or showed signs of weakness would face immediate punishment. Weapon training was incredibly comprehensive and went far beyond simply learning to swing a sword effectively. Every Roman legionary had to master the gladius, the famous short sword that was the primary close combat weapon. But this mastery required thousands of hours of practice against wooden posts, practice partners, and moving targets. The gladius was specifically designed for stabbing rather than slashing, which required precise timing and positioning that could only be developed through endless repetition. Recruits practiced the same basic sword movements hundreds of times each day until they became automatic responses that could be executed perfectly even in the chaos and terror of actual combat. But the gladius was only one weapon in the Roman arsenal. Every legionary also had to become proficient with the pilum, the heavy javelin that was thrown just before close combat began. The pilum wasn't just a simple spear. It was an ingeniously designed weapon with a long iron point attached to a wooden shaft in such a way that it would bend after impact, making it impossible for enemies to throw back and difficult to remove from shields. Learning to throw the pilum effectively required developing the strength to hurl a 6-foot spear accurately at distances up to 30 yards, while also understanding the tactical timing necessary to coordinate javelin volleys with thousands of other soldiers. Shield work was perhaps the most complex skill that recruits had to master, because the Roman scutum wasn't just defensive equipment, it was an integral part of both individual combat techniques and unit formations. The scutum was a large, curved, wooden shield covered with leather and reinforced with metal, weighing about 22 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet tall. Learning to maneuver this heavy, awkward piece of equipment while simultaneously wielding weapons required developing coordination and strength that would challenge even modern athletes. But individual shield proficiency was only the beginning. Recruits also had to learn to coordinate their shields with those of their fellow soldiers to create defensive walls and formations that could withstand cavalry charges and projectile attacks. Formation training consumed enormous amounts of time and energy because Roman military success depended on the ability of thousands of soldiers to move and fight as a single coordinated unit. The famous Roman formations like the testudo, or tortoise formation, where soldiers locked their shields together to create a mobile fortress, required incredible precision and trust between individual soldiers. Imagine trying to coordinate your movements with dozens of other people while carrying heavy equipment, following complex commands shouted over the noise of simulated combat, and maintaining your position even when the formation was under attack. Modern drill teams and marching bands might give you a tiny taste of this challenge, but Roman formations had to maintain cohesion while actually fighting for their lives. Physical conditioning went far beyond what we would consider normal fitness training. Roman soldiers needed to be able to march 25 miles per day while carrying equipment that weighed between 60 and 90 pounds, depending on their role and the specific campaign requirements. This wasn't occasional forced marching. This was the standard daily expectation during campaign season. To prepare for this reality, recruits spent hours each day marching with progressively heavier loads across increasingly difficult terrain. They started with relatively light packs and short distances, but by the end of training, they were expected to complete full-distance marches in the same time that would be expected of experienced veterans. The psychological aspects of training were just as demanding as the physical requirements. Roman military doctrine emphasized absolute obedience to orders regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. Recruits were deliberately placed in situations where they had to overcome their natural instincts for self-preservation and individual decision-making. They practiced maintaining formation discipline even when under simulated attack, following orders that might seem to contradict common sense, and trusting their fellow soldiers even in situations where individual action might seem safer or more logical. Discipline during training was maintained through a system of punishments that would be considered completely unacceptable by modern standards. Recruits who showed cowardice, disobedience, or lack of effort faced punishments ranging from reduced rations and extra duties to physical beatings and public humiliation. The most serious offenses could result in execution or discharge with disgrace, which would mark the offender as unfit for Roman citizenship and destroy any hope of social advancement. This harsh disciplinary system wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was designed to ensure that soldiers would maintain discipline and cohesion even in the most desperate combat situations where individual cowardice could lead to the destruction of entire units. Training also included extensive engineering and construction skills that had no modern military equivalent. Every Roman soldier was expected to be capable of building roads, bridges, siege equipment, and fortifications using only hand tools and locally available materials. Recruits spent weeks learning to use the delabra, a versatile tool that functioned as both pickaxe and shovel, and practicing construction techniques that would allow them to build a fortified camp every single night during campaign season. This wasn't optional training for engineering specialists. Every single legionary, from the lowest-ranking soldier to the officers, was expected to be capable of turning raw terrain into a defensible position using nothing but muscle power and traditional techniques. Once training was complete, Daily life in a Roman military camp would present challenges that would overwhelm most modern people within hours. The Roman military operated on a schedule and organizational system that was designed to maximize efficiency and maintain constant readiness for combat, which meant that personal comfort and individual preferences were never considerations in daily planning. The day began before dawn with a series of horn calls that served as the Roman equivalent of alarm clocks, except there was no snooze button and no possibility of sleeping in regardless of how tired you might be. The first call, known as the buccina, sounded while it was still dark and signaled the beginning of the daily routine. Within minutes of this first signal, every soldier in the camp was expected to be awake, dressed, and ready for inspection. Modern people who struggle to get out of bed for an 8 o'clock job would find this aspect of Roman military life particularly challenging, especially considering that the schedule remained the same regardless of weather conditions, illness, or how late duties had kept you awake the previous night. Morning inspection was a thorough examination of both personal appearance and equipment that would make modern military inspections look casual. Roman officers checked every piece of equipment for proper maintenance and readiness, examined each soldier's personal hygiene and uniform appearance, and verified that all assigned duties from the previous day had been completed satisfactorily. Soldiers whose equipment showed signs of neglect, whose personal appearance was unsatisfactory, or who had failed to complete assigned tasks faced immediate punishment that could range from extra duties to reduced rations. This daily inspection served multiple purposes. It ensured that equipment remained in fighting condition, maintained standards of discipline and professionalism, and identified potential problems before they could affect unit readiness. After inspection came the morning meal, which would be shocking to modern sensibilities both in its simplicity and in the speed with which it had to be consumed. Roman military rations were designed for nutrition and shelf life rather than flavor or variety. The basic soldier's breakfast typically consisted of bucellatum, a hard biscuit that was so tough it often had to be soaked in water or wine to make it edible, along with pasca, a drink made from water mixed with vinegar that served as both hydration and a source of vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Occasionally, there might be some cheese, dried meat, or olive oil to supplement this basic fare, but luxury items like fresh fruit, vegetables, or anything resembling modern breakfast foods were rare treats rather than daily expectations. The eating process itself was rigidly organized and timed. Soldiers ate in their assigned units, sitting in predetermined positions according to rank and seniority. Conversation during meals was limited to essential communication, and the entire meal had to be completed within a specified time period regardless of individual eating preferences or digestive needs. Modern people who are accustomed to leisurely breakfasts, choosing from multiple options, or eating according to personal schedules would find this regimented approach to nutrition both physically and psychologically challenging. Following the morning meal came equipment maintenance, which was far more complex and time-consuming than simply cleaning modern military gear. Roman soldiers were personally responsible for maintaining armor, weapons, and tools that were entirely handmade and required constant attention to remain functional. Armor made of metal strips or mail had to be cleaned, oiled, and inspected for damage that could compromise protection in combat. Weapons required sharpening, polishing, and careful examination for cracks or wear that might cause them to fail during use. Leather goods like belts, straps, and shield coverings needed regular treatment to prevent cracking and deterioration in various weather conditions. This maintenance work required skills that most modern people simply don't possess. Roman soldiers had to know how to sharpen blades using whetstones and achieve the precise edge geometry required for effective cutting and stabbing. They needed to understand metallurgy well enough to identify dangerous flaws in their weapons and armor. They had to master leatherworking techniques sufficient to repair and maintain complex pieces of equipment. Most challenging of all, they had to perform all of this maintenance work using only hand tools and techniques that had been passed down through generations of military service. The daily work assignments that followed equipment maintenance varied depending on the camp's current needs and the strategic situation, but they were always physically demanding and often required skills that would challenge modern workers. Soldiers might be assigned to construction projects like building or repairing roads, bridges, or fortifications. They might be tasked with gathering firewood, hauling water, or preparing food for the entire unit. Some might be assigned to guard duties that required standing at attention for hours in all weather conditions while remaining constantly alert for potential threats. Road construction, one of the most common assignments, was backbreaking work that required moving enormous quantities of earth and stone using only hand tools. Roman roads were built to last for centuries, which meant that every section had to be excavated to precise depths, filled with carefully graded layers of different materials, and topped with fitted stone blocks that were positioned with millimeter precision. A typical day of road building might involve moving several tons of material per person, all while maintaining the pace necessary to meet the legion's daily construction quotas. Guard duty presented different but equally challenging demands. Roman sentries were expected to remain alert and ready for action throughout their assigned shifts, which could last for several hours during daylight or shorter periods during the more dangerous nighttime hours. Falling asleep on guard duty was one of the most serious offenses in Roman military law and was often punishable by death. Guards had to memorize complex password systems, recognize authorized personnel even in poor lighting conditions, and maintain constant awareness of potential threats while dealing with boredom, fatigue, and uncomfortable weather conditions. Evening routines were just as regimented as morning activities and included responsibilities that would be completely foreign to modern experience. Before soldiers could rest, they had to participate in the construction or maintenance of the camp's defensive perimeter, which was rebuilt or reinforced every single night, regardless of whether the camp was in friendly or hostile territory. This wasn't a simple matter of setting up tents. Roman camps were surrounded by ditches, earthworks, and wooden palisades that created genuine fortifications capable of withstanding organized attacks. The evening meal was similar to breakfast in its simplicity and regimentation, though it might include additional items if the local supply situation was favorable or if hunting and foraging had been successful. Soldiers typically received a portion of bread or grain, some form of protein like cheese or dried meat, and vegetables when available. The meal was supplemented with olive oil for calories and flavor, and wine diluted with water that served both nutritional and social functions. However, the quantity and quality of food were entirely dependent on the supply situation, and soldiers were expected to maintain their strength and effectiveness even when rations were reduced due to logistical problems or enemy interference with supply lines. Sleep arrangements would be particularly challenging for people accustomed to modern privacy and comfort. Roman soldiers slept in shared tents that housed 8 to 10 men with minimal personal space and no privacy whatsoever. Each soldier had a sleeping area roughly equivalent to a modern twin mattress, but instead of a comfortable bed, they slept on the ground using only a thin blanket or cloak for padding. Personal belongings had to be kept to an absolute minimum due to space constraints and the need to pack and move the entire camp quickly when orders required relocation. The noise level in these shared accommodations would be constant and disruptive by modern standards. With nearly a dozen men sharing close quarters, there would always be someone snoring, moving around, or dealing with digestive issues related to the military diet. Privacy for personal needs was essentially non-existent, and soldiers had to become comfortable with sharing the most intimate aspects of daily life with their tent mates. Modern people who value personal space and quiet time for relaxation would find this aspect of Roman military life particularly stressful and exhausting. Night security duties meant that even during supposed rest periods, soldiers might be awakened for guard duty, patrol assignments, or emergency situations. The camp maintained constant security throughout the night, with guards posted at regular intervals around the entire perimeter, and patrol units moving through the surrounding area to watch for enemy activity. Sleep was always conditional and could be interrupted at any moment by military necessity, which meant that soldiers had to learn to rest when possible rather than expecting regular, uninterrupted sleep schedules. The equipment and gear that Roman soldiers were required to carry and maintain would be overwhelming by modern standards, both in terms of weight and complexity. When we think about soldiers today, we might picture someone with a rifle, some ammunition, and a relatively lightweight pack with modern materials and ergonomic design. Roman legionaries carried equipment loads that would challenge modern special forces soldiers, and all of this gear was made from materials like iron, leather, and wood that were much heavier than modern alternatives. The primary defensive equipment began with the lorica, the Roman body armor that came in several different styles depending on the historical period and the soldier's rank. Early legionaries wore lorica hamata, mail armor made from thousands of interlinked iron rings that provided excellent protection but weighed between 25 and 30 pounds. Later periods saw the introduction of lorica segmentata, the segmented plate armor that is most commonly associated with Roman legionaries in popular culture. This armor was actually lighter than mail, weighing around 20 pounds, but it required constant maintenance to keep the metal strips properly aligned and the leather strapping in good condition. Maintaining Roman armor was a daily responsibility that required skills most modern people don't possess. Mail armor had to be cleaned regularly to prevent rust, and damaged rings had to be replaced using techniques that were essentially blacksmithing skills. The soldier had to be able to identify weak points in the mail that could fail in combat, and he needed to know how to make field repairs using portable tools and materials. Segmented armor was even more complex, with multiple leather straps and bronze fittings that could break or wear out, requiring constant adjustment and replacement. The Roman helmet, or gellia, was another essential piece of equipment that was far more sophisticated than it might appear. These helmets weren't just simple metal caps. They were carefully designed pieces of protective equipment that had to balance protection, weight, visibility, and hearing. The helmet included a neck guard to protect against attacks from behind, cheek pieces that could be tied under the chin for maximum protection, and a carefully shaped crown that would deflect blows while remaining light enough for long-term wear. Many helmets also included decorative plumes or crests that served both ceremonial functions and practical battlefield identification purposes. Helmet maintenance required understanding metalworking techniques and having access to specialized tools and materials. The bronze or iron had to be kept clean and rust-free. The internal padding had to be replaced periodically, and the various straps and fittings needed constant adjustment and repair. Soldiers also had to know how to modify their helmets for different situations, attaching or removing decorative elements, adjusting the fit for different activities, and making field repairs when the equipment was damaged in combat or during training. The famous Roman shield, or scutum, was perhaps the most complex piece of equipment that every soldier had to master. These shields weren't simple, flat pieces of wood. They were curved, laminated constructions that combined multiple layers of different materials to create protection that was both strong and relatively lightweight. The basic shield was made from wooden planks that were glued together and covered with leather or canvas, then edged with bronze or iron strips and fitted with an iron boss in the center for deflecting attacks. Shield maintenance was incredibly labor-intensive and required a variety of specialized skills. The leather covering had to be kept supple and waterproof using oils and treatments that soldiers had to prepare themselves. The wooden core could crack or split, requiring repair techniques that were essentially carpentry skills. The metal fittings could loosen or break, needing metalworking repairs that had to be performed with portable tools. Most challenging of all, the shield's effectiveness depended on maintaining its precise curve and balance, which could be altered by damage, weather exposure, or normal wear and tear. Offensive weapons presented their own maintenance challenges that would be completely foreign to modern experience. The gladius, the famous Roman short sword, required daily attention to maintain the edge geometry and overall condition necessary for effective combat use. Roman swords weren't just sharpened pieces of metal. They were precisely engineered tools with specific blade profiles, tang constructions, and handle arrangements that all had to be maintained within tight tolerances. Sword maintenance required understanding metallurgy, having access to proper sharpening stones and tools, and possessing the skill to maintain consistent edge angles and blade geometry. Soldiers had to be able to identify different types of damage that could affect sword performance, nicks that reduced cutting effectiveness, chips that could propagate into cracks, and wear patterns that indicated fundamental problems with the blade. They also had to know how to make field repairs and modifications, such as adjusting the handle wrap for better grip or modifying the balance point for different combat situations. The pilum, the Roman javelin, was an ingeniously designed weapon that required specific maintenance techniques to remain effective. The pilum's iron point was intentionally made from softer metal that would bend on impact, preventing enemies from throwing the weapon back and making it difficult to remove from shields. However, this design meant that each pilum could only be used once in combat, so soldiers had to carry multiple javelins and understand how to straighten and repair the points when possible. Personal equipment extended far beyond weapons and armor to include all the tools and supplies necessary for campaign life. Every soldier carried a marching pack, or sarcina, that contained his personal belongings, spare equipment, and rations. The pack itself was a leather construction that had to be waterproofed and maintained to protect its contents during long marches in various weather conditions. Packing the sarcina was an art form that required balancing weight distribution, access to essential items, and protection of fragile equipment. The contents of a typical marching pack would surprise modern soldiers with both their variety and their weight. In addition to spare clothing and personal items, soldiers carried cooking equipment, including a bronze or iron mess tin, a cup, and utensils. They carried tools for equipment maintenance, such as whetstones, oil for leather and metal care, and spare parts for armor and weapons. Construction tools were essential, including a delabra for digging and cutting, rope for various engineering tasks, and sometimes specialized tools depending on the soldier's assignment within the legion. Medical supplies were another essential component of personal equipment, though they were far more primitive than modern first aid kits. Soldiers carried items like clean cloth for bandages, basic herbal remedies for common ailments, and sometimes simple surgical instruments for treating minor wounds. However, the effectiveness of these supplies depended on the soldier's knowledge of field medicine, which was gained through experience rather than formal training. Personal hygiene items were minimal but essential for maintaining health during long campaigns. Soldiers carried soap made from animal fat and ash, rough cloth for washing, and sometimes a bronze razor for maintaining grooming standards. Dental care consisted of chewing on twigs or using rough cloth to clean teeth, supplemented by vinegar rinses that served both cleaning and antiseptic functions. The total weight of a fully equipped Roman legionary's gear ranged from 60 to 90 pounds, depending on his specific role and the campaign requirements. This enormous load had to be carried during marches that could last for weeks or months, over terrain that ranged from paved roads to mountain paths to trackless wilderness. Modern soldiers with lightweight synthetic materials and ergonomic designs still find heavy pack loads challenging. Roman soldiers accomplished this feat using only leather straps and bronze fittings that distributed weight poorly and created pressure points that could cause serious injuries during long marches. Life on campaign would present challenges that would be almost incomprehensible to modern experience, combining physical hardship, constant danger, and logistical problems that tested every aspect of human endurance and adaptability. When Roman legions moved out on campaign, they weren't just marching to a destination, they were essentially moving entire cities across hostile territory while remaining ready for combat at all times. Campaign marching was conducted according to strict schedules and formations that prioritized military effectiveness over individual comfort. A typical day's march covered 25 Roman miles, which equals about 23 modern miles, and this distance had to be completed regardless of weather conditions, terrain difficulty, or the physical condition of individual soldiers. The marching pace was standardized across the entire army, which meant that soldiers had to maintain formation discipline even when exhausted, injured, or dealing with equipment problems. The marching formation itself was a complex arrangement designed to provide security while maintaining the ability to respond quickly to enemy contact. Different types of units, heavy infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supply trains were positioned according to tactical doctrine that had been developed through centuries of military experience. Individual soldiers had to maintain precise positions within this formation while carrying their heavy equipment loads and remaining constantly alert for enemy activity or orders from their officers. Weather presented constant challenges that modern people, accustomed to climate-controlled environments and weather forecasting, would find particularly difficult to handle. Roman armies campaigned in all seasons and in all types of weather conditions, from the scorching heat of Middle Eastern summers to the freezing conditions of Germanic winters. Soldiers had to be prepared to march and fight in driving rain that turned roads into rivers of mud, snowstorms that reduced visibility to a few yards, and desert conditions where water became more precious than gold. Equipment maintenance during campaign conditions was far more difficult than the already challenging requirements of camp life. Gear that was constantly exposed to harsh weather conditions deteriorated rapidly and had to be repaired using whatever materials were available locally. Leather goods dried out and cracked in hot climates, then rotted in humid conditions. Metal equipment rusted quickly when exposed to rain and snow, especially when soldiers were too exhausted to perform proper maintenance routines. Weapons and armor that weren't maintained properly could fail in combat, which meant that equipment care was literally a matter of life and death. The daily routine of setting up and breaking down marching camps was an engineering feat that would challenge modern construction crews with power tools and heavy machinery. Every evening, regardless of fatigue levels or weather conditions, the entire legion had to construct a fortified camp that could defend against organized attacks. This wasn't a matter of simply pitching tents. Roman marching camps included ditches, earthwork walls, wooden palisades, and internal organization that created a temporary fortress capable of housing thousands of men and their equipment. The construction process began immediately upon arrival at the designated campsite, with different units assigned to specific tasks according to a predetermined plan. Some soldiers were responsible for surveying the site and marking out the camp's boundaries and internal layout. Others began digging the defensive ditch that would surround the entire perimeter, using hand tools to move enormous quantities of earth in a very short time. Still others were assigned to cut timber and construct the wooden palisade that would crown the earthwork walls. Each soldier's individual tent had to be erected according to precise specifications and positioned exactly according to the camp's organizational plan. Roman camps weren't random collections of shelters. They were carefully planned communities with designated areas for different types of activities, clear transportation routes, and strategic positions for defensive strongpoints. Setting up camp wasn't just about providing shelter for the night. It was about creating a tactical advantage that could determine the outcome of the campaign. Breaking camp each morning was equally complex and had to be accomplished quickly enough to maintain the army's marching schedule. Everything that had been constructed the previous evening had to be disassembled, packed, and loaded for transport. The defensive works had to be destroyed to prevent them from being used by enemy forces, which meant that soldiers spent time and energy demolishing the same fortifications they had built just hours earlier. Foraging and supply management presented constant challenges that would overwhelm modern logistical systems. Roman armies were too large to depend entirely on supply trains carrying food from distant bases. They had to supplement their rations with locally available resources, which meant that soldiers needed to know how to identify, gather, and prepare wild foods while remaining ready for combat operations. Foraging was a skilled activity that required botanical knowledge, hunting abilities, and an understanding of local geography that most modern people completely lack. Soldiers had to be able to identify edible plants, nuts, and roots while avoiding poisonous varieties that could incapacitate or kill them. They needed to know how to trap small game, catch fish, and locate water sources that were safe for drinking. Most importantly, they had to accomplish all of this while remaining in organized units that could respond to enemy contact and while avoiding damage to local resources that might be needed by Roman settlers or allied populations. Water procurement was perhaps the most critical aspect of campaign logistics, and it presented challenges that modern people, accustomed to turning on taps for unlimited clean water, would find almost impossible to manage. Roman armies needed enormous quantities of water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and caring for animals, but they couldn't depend on finding suitable water sources at convenient locations along their route. Soldiers had to know how to locate groundwater, purify questionable water sources, and ration their personal water supplies during periods when clean water wasn't available. The water quality standards that Roman soldiers had to accept would be completely unacceptable by modern health standards. Water sources along campaign routes were often contaminated by animal waste, human waste from previous armies, or natural minerals that made the water unpalatable or even dangerous. Soldiers learned to improve water quality by allowing sediments to settle, straining out visible contaminants, and adding vinegar or wine to kill harmful organisms. But these primitive purification methods were far from foolproof. Water rationing during desert campaigns or siege situations required discipline that would test anyone's psychological limits. Soldiers might receive as little as a pint of water per day for all their needs: drinking, food preparation, and minimal personal hygiene. Modern people who are accustomed to drinking water whenever they feel thirsty, taking long showers, and using water freely for cleaning would find this level of rationing almost unbearable, especially when combined with the physical demands of marching and combat. Food preparation during campaigns was a communal activity that required cooperation, planning, and skills that modern people have largely lost. Soldiers were organized into units of 8 men called contubernia, and each contubernium was responsible for preparing meals using shared equipment and rations. This meant that individual food preferences were irrelevant. You ate what the group prepared, when they prepared it, and in the quantities available, regardless of your personal hunger or taste preferences. The cooking process itself was challenging because it had to be accomplished quickly, using minimal fuel, and often under conditions where fires were restricted for security reasons. Roman soldiers became skilled at preparing nutritious meals from basic ingredients like grain, dried meat, and preserved vegetables, using only portable cooking equipment and whatever fuel could be gathered locally. They learned to make bread using portable ovens or heated stones, prepare stews that would stretch limited ingredients to feed the entire unit, and preserve leftover food in ways that would prevent spoilage during continued marching. Seasonal variations in campaign conditions created additional challenges that required constant adaptation and flexibility. Summer campaigns in hot climates meant dealing with extreme temperatures that could cause heat exhaustion, dehydration, and equipment failures. Metal armor became almost unbearably hot under direct sunlight, leather goods dried out and cracked, and water sources became scarce or contaminated. Soldiers had to adjust their marching schedules to avoid the worst heat, modify their equipment to deal with high temperatures, and ration their water supplies more carefully. Winter campaigns were equally challenging, but presented completely different problems. Freezing temperatures made metal equipment brittle and dangerous to handle with bare skin. Snow and ice made marching treacherous and exhausting, while also making it difficult to find adequate shelter and fuel for heating. Food that was preserved for warm weather storage could freeze solid, making it impossible to prepare and consume. Soldiers had to learn to modify their equipment for cold weather conditions, find ways to keep warm without adequate fuel supplies, and maintain their health and strength when their bodies were burning enormous numbers of calories just to maintain body temperature. River crossings during campaigns presented engineering challenges that would stump modern construction crews, and Roman soldiers were expected to solve these problems using only hand tools and materials available locally. Major rivers couldn't simply be forded. They required the construction of temporary bridges capable of supporting thousands of soldiers along with their equipment, animals, and supply wagons. Building these bridges required engineering skills, coordination between large numbers of workers, and the ability to work in dangerous conditions with fast-moving water and potential enemy interference. The bridge-building process began with reconnaissance to identify the best crossing location, taking into account factors like water depth, current strength, bottom composition, and defensive possibilities. Soldiers then had to cut timber to precise specifications, construct foundation supports that could withstand the river's current, and assemble bridge sections that were strong enough to support heavy loads while remaining light enough to be built with human labor alone. Mountain crossings presented different but equally serious challenges that tested every aspect of Roman military organization and individual soldier capabilities. Mountain terrain made normal marching formations impossible, so units had to be reorganized into smaller groups that could navigate narrow paths while maintaining communication and security. The thin air at high altitudes reduced physical capacity and made even normal activities exhausting. Weather conditions in mountains could change rapidly from clear skies to deadly storms that made continued movement impossible. Equipment failures during mountain campaigns could be fatal because there were no opportunities for resupply or major repairs. Soldiers had to carry everything they needed for the entire crossing, including extra food, fuel, and warm clothing, which meant that pack weights reached the absolute limits of human endurance. Navigation became critical because getting lost in mountain terrain could mean death from exposure, starvation, or enemy action. Desert campaigns created a completely different set of survival challenges that would overwhelm most modern people within days. The combination of extreme heat, water scarcity, and navigation difficulties made desert operations some of the most dangerous assignments in the Roman military. Soldiers had to learn to recognize the signs of heat-related illnesses, ration their water supplies over periods of days or weeks, and navigate using celestial markers and terrain features that were often obscured by sandstorms or heat distortion. Sand presented constant problems that affected everything from equipment maintenance to personal health. Fine sand worked its way into armor joints, weapon mechanisms, and food supplies, causing equipment failures and making meals unpleasant or even dangerous to consume. Sandstorms could last for days and make normal military operations impossible while creating navigation hazards that could scatter units across vast distances. The combination of heat and sand caused skin irritation and infections that could become serious medical problems without proper treatment. Roman soldiers became expert engineers and construction workers by necessity because their military effectiveness often depended on their ability to build roads, siege equipment, fortifications, and other infrastructure using only hand tools and locally available materials. This engineering capability was one of the major factors that distinguished Roman armies from their opponents and allowed them to operate effectively in terrain and conditions that would stop other military forces. Road construction was perhaps the most important engineering skill that Roman soldiers had to master, because good roads were essential for rapid troop movement, supply transportation, and communication between different parts of the empire. Roman roads weren't simple dirt tracks. They were sophisticated construction projects that required surveying skills, understanding of drainage and foundation engineering, and the ability to organize large work crews efficiently. The road building process began with careful surveying to determine the optimal route, taking into account factors like grade, drainage, defensibility, and connection to existing transportation networks. Roman military engineers used sophisticated surveying instruments and techniques to lay out roads that maintained consistent grades over long distances, even in challenging terrain. They understood principles of road engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the modern era. Foundation construction required moving enormous quantities of earth and stone using only human labor and hand tools. Roman roads were built in layers, with each layer designed to serve specific structural and drainage functions. The foundation layer consisted of large stones carefully arranged to provide a stable base and allow water drainage. This was followed by layers of progressively smaller stones, gravel, and sand that created a smooth, durable surface capable of supporting heavy traffic for centuries. The surface layer of major Roman roads consisted of carefully fitted stone blocks that were positioned with millimeter precision and secured with mortar or metal clamps. Creating this surface required stoneworking skills that were essentially sculpture techniques, with each block cut and shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors, while maintaining proper drainage slopes and surface smoothness. The quality of Roman road construction is evidenced by the fact that many Roman roads are still in use today, nearly 2,000 years after they were built. Siege equipment construction required understanding mechanical engineering principles and the ability to build complex machines using wood, rope, and metal components that were fabricated entirely by hand. Roman armies carried some portable siege equipment, but major sieges required the construction of specialized machines like catapults, ballistae, and siege towers that were built on site using local materials and soldier labor. Building a Roman catapult was a complex engineering project that required precise understanding of leverage ratios, torsion mechanics, and structural engineering. The wooden framework had to be constructed with joints that could withstand enormous stresses without failing, using only traditional woodworking techniques and hand tools. The torsion springs that provided the machine's power had to be made from rope or sinew that was twisted to exactly the right tension and secured with bronze or iron fittings that were forged on site. Siege towers were even more complex construction projects that combined engineering, carpentry, and tactical planning. These were essentially mobile fortifications that had to be tall enough to overtop enemy walls, strong enough to resist defensive fire, and mobile enough to be moved into position under combat conditions. Construction required coordination between dozens of workers, sophisticated understanding of structural engineering, and the ability to solve construction problems using only materials available locally. The construction process for major siege equipment could take weeks or months, during which the soldiers had to maintain security, continue their regular duties, and deal with enemy attempts to interfere with the construction. Workers were often under fire from enemy defenders, which meant that engineering projects had to be completed while wearing armor and remaining ready for combat. The psychological pressure of working under these conditions, combined with the technical demands of the construction work, would challenge even modern military engineers with power tools and prefabricated components. Bridge construction during sieges or river crossings required engineering skills that rivaled those of professional bridge builders. Roman military bridges had to be constructed quickly, using whatever materials were available locally, while potentially under enemy fire. These weren't simple log bridges. They were sophisticated structures capable of supporting thousands of soldiers, cavalry units, artillery pieces, and supply wagons. The engineering principles involved in Roman bridge construction included understanding load distribution, foundation engineering, and structural dynamics that wouldn't be formally codified until much later in history. Soldiers had to be able to calculate the strength requirements for different bridge components, design foundation systems that could resist water pressure and structural loads, and coordinate construction activities that required precise timing and cooperation between large numbers of workers. Aqueduct construction for permanent fortifications required even more advanced engineering knowledge and construction skills. Roman military engineers built aqueducts that transported water over distances of many miles, using gravity flow systems that maintained consistent water pressure and flow rates. These projects required surveying accuracy that achieved grade tolerances of less than 1% over distances of many miles, using only optical surveying instruments and manual calculation methods. The construction work involved in aqueduct building included tunnel excavation through solid rock, bridge construction across valleys and rivers, and the fabrication of water distribution systems that served entire military installations. Soldiers working on these projects had to master stone-cutting techniques that produced watertight joints without modern sealants, metalworking skills for fabricating pipes and fittings, and hydraulic engineering knowledge for designing distribution systems that provided adequate water pressure for all users. Camp fortification construction was a daily requirement that every Roman soldier had to master, because the security of the entire army depended on the quality of defensive works that were built and rebuilt constantly during campaign operations. Roman marching camps weren't temporary shelters. They were sophisticated fortifications that could withstand organized attacks and provide secure bases for military operations. The fortification process began with site selection that took into account defensive advantages, water availability, supply access, and strategic positioning. Roman military engineers understood terrain analysis and defensive planning that allowed them to maximize the defensive value of natural features while minimizing the construction effort required. They knew how to use hills, rivers, and other terrain features to create defensive positions that were almost impregnable when properly constructed and defended. Earthwork construction formed the backbone of Roman field fortifications, and it required moving enormous quantities of soil using only hand tools and human labor. The standard Roman camp was surrounded by a ditch and rampart system that created a formidable obstacle to enemy attack. The ditch had to be deep enough and wide enough to stop cavalry charges and infantry assaults, while the earth removed from the ditch was used to build ramparts that provided elevated firing positions for defenders. The construction standards for Roman earthworks were precisely specified and had to be maintained regardless of time constraints, weather conditions, or soldier fatigue. The ditch had to be a specific width and depth, with sides sloped at angles that prevented easy climbing while remaining stable under various soil conditions. The rampart had to be built to specific height and width requirements, with a level top surface for defenders and a steep face toward potential attackers. Wooden palisade construction completed the defensive system and required carpentry skills that produced structures capable of stopping infantry assaults and providing cover for defenders. The palisade consisted of wooden stakes or logs that were sharpened to points and set in the top of the rampart at angles designed to impale attackers while providing firing ports for defenders. Building the palisade required cutting timber to precise specifications, setting the posts at exact angles and spacings, and securing the entire structure so that it could withstand impacts from enemy weapons and attempts to tear it down. The military hierarchy and discipline system of the Roman army would be completely alien to modern democratic sensibilities and would present psychological challenges that most contemporary people would find unbearable. Roman military organization was based on absolute authority and unquestioning obedience, with a chain of command that extended from the lowest-ranking soldier all the way to the emperor himself. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the basic legionaries, the milites, who had no authority over anyone and were expected to obey orders instantly and without question. Modern people who are accustomed to having their opinions heard, participating in decision-making processes, and questioning authority when they disagree with decisions would find the complete powerlessness of the basic Roman soldier psychologically devastating. Legionaries couldn't choose their assignments, couldn't refuse dangerous missions, couldn't request transfers, and couldn't even speak unless given permission by their superiors. Above the basic soldiers were the principales, experienced soldiers who had earned positions of responsibility within their units. These included positions like the signifer, who carried the unit's standard and was responsible for maintaining unit cohesion during combat, and the optio, who served as second in command of a century and was responsible for training and discipline. However, even these positions of relative authority were still subject to absolute control by higher-ranking officers, and principales could be reduced to common soldier status for any infraction of military discipline. The centurions formed the backbone of Roman military leadership and wielded authority that would be shocking by modern standards. A centurion had complete control over the lives of the soldiers under his command, with the power to order floggings, assign dangerous duties, and even execute soldiers for serious offenses. Centurions were expected to maintain discipline through a combination of leadership, expertise, and fear, and they were held personally responsible for the performance and behavior of their units. The punishment system that maintained Roman military discipline would be considered brutal and inhumane by modern standards, but it was considered essential for maintaining the cohesion and effectiveness that allowed Roman armies to operate successfully in the most challenging conditions. Punishments were designed not just to correct individual behavior, but to serve as examples that would deter similar infractions by other soldiers. Minor infractions like negligence in equipment maintenance, tardiness, or disrespectful behavior towards superiors resulted in punishments that included extra duties, reduced rations, or assignment to particularly unpleasant tasks like latrine cleaning or camp construction. These punishments might seem relatively mild, but when combined with the already harsh conditions of military life, they could be genuinely difficult to endure. More serious offenses like cowardice in combat, desertion attempts, or theft from fellow soldiers resulted in physical punishments that included flogging with rods or whips.
These beatings weren't token gestures. They were severe enough to cause permanent injury or even death, and they were administered in front of the entire unit to maximize their psychological impact on other soldiers.
The knowledge that any serious misconduct could result in public humiliation and severe physical punishment created constant psychological pressure that would be intolerable for most modern people. The most serious military crimes, including actual desertion, mutiny, or treachery, were punishable by death, and executions were carried out publicly to serve as warnings to other soldiers. However, the death penalty could also be applied to entire units that failed in their duties through a process called decimation, where every 10th soldier was executed regardless of individual guilt or innocence. This collective punishment system created peer pressure that made every soldier responsible for the behavior of his comrades, because individual misconduct could literally cost the lives of innocent men. The psychological impact of living under this disciplinary system would be overwhelming for people raised in cultures that emphasize individual rights and due process. Roman soldiers knew that their lives depended not only on their own behavior, but on the actions of their fellow soldiers, their officers' mood, and military necessities that were completely beyond their control. The constant awareness that death or severe punishment could result from circumstances beyond their influence created stress levels that would be considered unbearable by modern psychological standards. Leadership responsibilities within the Roman military system were just as demanding as the obedience expected from subordinates, and Roman officers were held to standards of personal conduct and professional competence that would challenge even experienced modern military leaders. Officers weren't just tactical commanders. They were expected to be experts in engineering, logistics, administration, diplomacy, and personal combat, while also serving as moral examples for their subordinates. A Roman centurion was expected to be the first into combat and the last to retreat, sharing all the dangers and hardships of his soldiers while maintaining the authority necessary to lead them effectively. This meant that officers couldn't rely on rank alone to maintain their authority. They had to continuously prove their competence and courage under the most challenging conditions. Officers who failed to meet these standards faced not only the loss of their positions, but potential prosecution for military incompetence that could result in execution or exile. The administrative responsibilities of Roman officers included maintaining detailed records of unit strength, equipment condition, supply requirements, and individual soldier performance. These records weren't just paperwork, they were critical information that determined supply allocations, tactical assignments, and personnel decisions that affected the lives of thousands of men. Officers had to master complex administrative systems using only written records and manual calculation methods, while also handling their combat and training responsibilities. Combat realities that Roman soldiers faced would be far more brutal and psychologically traumatic than anything most modern people could imagine surviving. Contemporary warfare, despite its dangers, is conducted with weapons that can kill at long range and protective equipment that significantly improves survival odds. Roman combat was primarily hand-to-hand fighting with edged weapons, where survival depended on individual skill, unit cohesion, and the willingness to engage in close personal combat that was essentially organized mutual slaughter. The psychological preparation for Roman combat began during training and continued throughout a soldier's career, but it could never completely prepare anyone for the reality of fighting for their life with sword and shield against opponents who were equally skilled and desperate. Roman soldiers had to be able to function effectively while surrounded by the sounds, smells, and sights of violent death, maintaining their formation discipline and tactical awareness even when their friends were being killed inches away from them. Formation fighting required a level of trust and cooperation that would be difficult for modern individualistic people to achieve. Roman tactical success depended on soldiers maintaining their positions in formation even when individual action might offer better chances of personal survival. Soldiers had to trust that their comrades would protect their flanks and rear, while simultaneously accepting responsibility for protecting their fellow soldiers even at the cost of their own lives. The physical reality of Roman combat was exhausting beyond modern comprehension. Fighting with sword and shield while wearing heavy armor required enormous physical strength and endurance, especially during battles that could last for hours. Soldiers had to maintain their combat effectiveness even when exhausted, dehydrated, and injured, because showing weakness or fatigue could invite enemy attacks that would kill not only the individual soldier but potentially break the formation and endanger the entire unit. Siege warfare presented particularly challenging combat conditions that combined the stress of normal battle with the additional horrors of prolonged operations in confined spaces. Soldiers attacking fortified positions had to advance across open ground under heavy missile fire, then fight hand-to-hand combat on walls and in narrow passages where tactical formations were impossible and individual combat skills determined survival. Defending against siege attacks was equally traumatic, with soldiers facing constant bombardment from enemy artillery, surprise attacks that could come at any time of day or night, and the psychological pressure of being trapped in a confined area with diminishing supplies and no possibility of retreat. Siege operations could last for months, during which soldiers had to maintain their combat readiness while dealing with hunger, disease, and the constant stress of knowing that capture might mean death or slavery. The weapons used in Roman combat were designed specifically for killing humans, and using them effectively required overcoming natural psychological inhibitions against violence that most modern people have never had to confront. The gladius was optimized for stabbing attacks that targeted vital organs, and Roman training emphasized techniques that were most likely to inflict fatal wounds quickly and efficiently. Learning to use these weapons effectively meant practicing movements and techniques whose only purpose was to kill other human beings. Combat injuries were common and often severe, and Roman soldiers had to be prepared to continue fighting even when wounded. Modern military medical care can treat injuries that would have been fatal in ancient times, but Roman soldiers knew that serious wounds often meant death or permanent disability with no possibility of modern medical intervention. The psychological impact of seeing the consequences of combat injuries, combined with the knowledge that similar injuries could happen to anyone at any time, created stress that would overwhelm most contemporary people. Medical care and injury treatment in the Roman military were primitive by modern standards, but represented the most advanced medical knowledge available at the time. Roman military medicine was based on practical experience gained through centuries of treating combat wounds and campaign-related illnesses, supplemented by medical theories that were often incorrect, but sometimes surprisingly effective. Field medicine was practiced by soldiers who had learned basic medical skills through experience rather than formal training, because Roman armies couldn't depend on having trained physicians available for every medical emergency. Every soldier was expected to know basic wound care, including how to stop bleeding, clean wounds, and apply bandages using materials that were available in field conditions. This meant that soldiers had to be comfortable treating severe injuries that would send modern people into shock just from witnessing them. The basic medical supplies carried by Roman soldiers were limited to items that were portable, durable, and had multiple uses. Clean cloth for bandages was essential, but it had to be rationed carefully because replacement materials weren't always available. Vinegar served multiple medical purposes. It could be used to clean wounds, as an antiseptic to prevent infection, and as a general disinfectant for medical equipment. Wine was sometimes available for similar purposes, and was also used as a mild anesthetic for painful procedures. Herbal remedies formed a significant part of Roman military medicine, and soldiers were expected to learn to identify and use medicinal plants that were available in different geographical regions. This botanical knowledge had to be extensive and accurate because using the wrong plant could be more dangerous than providing no treatment at all. Soldiers learned to prepare poultices, teas, and other herbal preparations that could treat common military ailments like digestive problems, respiratory infections, and skin conditions. Surgical procedures in the Roman military were limited to techniques that could be performed with basic instruments and without modern anesthesia or antiseptic conditions. Minor procedures like removing arrow points or stitching cuts were relatively common and could be performed by experienced soldiers using wine for anesthesia and vinegar for antiseptic purposes. More serious procedures like amputations were sometimes attempted, but the survival rate was low due to infection, blood loss, and shock. Pain management was one of the most challenging aspects of Roman military medicine because effective pain medications weren't available, and soldiers were expected to remain functional even when dealing with significant injuries. Roman medical practice relied heavily on alcohol, opium when it was available, and herbal remedies that had mild analgesic properties. However, most pain management was essentially psychological, depending on the soldier's ability to endure discomfort without modern pharmaceutical assistance. Infection was the leading cause of death from combat wounds, and Roman medical practice had limited ability to prevent or treat serious infections. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs of infection and knew some techniques for treating infected wounds, but these methods were often ineffective against serious bacterial infections. Many soldiers who survived the initial injury from combat wounds later died from infections that could be easily treated with modern antibiotics. Hospital organization in permanent Roman military installations was sophisticated for its time and provided medical care that was superior to what was available to civilian populations. Roman military hospitals were designed with specialized areas for different types of treatment, including surgical suites, recovery wards, and isolation areas for patients with contagious diseases. These hospitals were staffed with soldiers who had developed medical expertise through experience, supplemented by civilian physicians when they were available. Recovery and rehabilitation from serious injuries was a lengthy process that often determined whether a soldier could return to active duty or would be discharged from military service. Roman military medicine understood the importance of gradual rehabilitation and physical therapy, though these concepts weren't formalized in the way they are today. Soldiers recovering from injuries were given progressively more demanding physical tasks designed to restore their strength and coordination. Mental health issues, which we now recognize as common consequences of combat exposure, weren't understood by Roman military medicine in modern terms, but Roman commanders did recognize that some soldiers became unable to function effectively after prolonged combat exposure. These soldiers might be assigned to non-combat duties or discharged from service, though there was no systematic approach to treating what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Common injuries and illnesses that affected Roman soldiers included problems that were directly related to military service and others that resulted from the harsh living conditions of campaign life. Combat injuries ranged from minor cuts and bruises to severe wounds that caused permanent disability or death. Non-combat injuries were also common and included problems like sprains and fractures from marching with heavy loads, repetitive stress injuries from constant weapons training, and accidents during construction work. Digestive problems were extremely common among Roman soldiers and resulted from the poor quality of military rations, contaminated water supplies, and the stress of military life. Soldiers frequently suffered from dysentery, food poisoning, and nutritional deficiencies that weakened their immune systems and made them susceptible to other illnesses. These digestive issues could be as debilitating as combat injuries and were often more difficult to treat effectively. Respiratory infections were another common problem, especially during winter campaigns or when soldiers were crowded together in poorly ventilated accommodations. These infections spread rapidly through military units and could significantly reduce combat effectiveness even when they weren't life-threatening. Roman soldiers learned to recognize the symptoms of common respiratory ailments and knew some herbal remedies that could provide relief, but serious respiratory infections often had to run their course without effective treatment. Pay, benefits, and retirement provisions for Roman soldiers were structured differently from modern military compensation and reflected the different economic and social conditions of ancient Rome. Roman military service was simultaneously one of the few paths to social advancement available to common people and a financial commitment that could impoverish families if the soldier was killed or seriously injured before completing his term of service. Basic military pay, or stipendium, was calculated on an annual basis, but was distributed in smaller installments throughout the year to prevent soldiers from accumulating large sums of money that might tempt them to desert. The actual amount of pay varied depending on the historical period, the soldier's rank, and the legion's assignment, but it was generally sufficient to support a single man at a basic subsistence level. However, this base pay was subject to numerous deductions that significantly reduced the amount that soldiers actually received. Deductions from military pay included charges for food, equipment replacement, burial insurance, and various fees that were imposed by commanders for administrative purposes. These deductions could consume a significant portion of a soldier's base pay, leaving him with very little disposable income for personal needs or sending money to family members. Soldiers who came from poor families often found that their military pay wasn't sufficient to support relatives back home, which created additional psychological stress during an already difficult period of service. Food deductions were particularly significant because military rations were expensive and soldiers were charged for all the food they consumed, regardless of its quality or their personal preferences. During campaigns, when foraging was successful, these charges might be reduced, but during difficult periods when food had to be transported long distances or purchased at high prices, food costs could consume most of a soldier's pay. Equipment replacement costs were another major expense that could create financial hardship for soldiers whose gear was damaged or lost during campaign operations. While the military provided basic equipment initially, soldiers were responsible for maintaining and replacing their gear throughout their service period. Combat damage, normal wear and tear, and accidents during training or construction work could require expensive equipment replacements that had to be paid for from the soldier's modest salary. Bonus payments, called donativa, were distributed on special occasions like military victories, imperial anniversaries, or successful completion of particularly difficult campaigns. These bonuses could be substantial and represented the primary opportunity for soldiers to accumulate significant savings during their military service. However, bonuses were unpredictable and couldn't be relied upon for financial planning, which meant that soldiers had to budget based on their base pay alone. Land grants and citizenship benefits were among the most valuable aspects of Roman military service and represented long-term compensation that could provide security for veterans and their families. Upon completion of military service, soldiers were eligible to receive grants of land that could be used for farming or other economic activities. These land grants were usually located in newly conquered territories or in areas where the Roman government wanted to establish veteran communities. The land grant system served multiple purposes for the Roman state. It provided compensation for military service, created communities of loyal Roman citizens in strategic locations, and helped to Romanize conquered territories by establishing populations that were committed to Roman culture and government. For individual soldiers, land grants represented the opportunity to achieve economic independence and social status that would have been impossible through other means. Citizenship benefits were particularly valuable for soldiers who hadn't been born as Roman citizens, which included many auxiliary troops and soldiers from recently conquered territories. Military service was one of the most reliable paths to Roman citizenship, which provided legal protections, economic opportunities, and social status that were unavailable to non-citizens. For many soldiers, the citizenship benefits of military service were more valuable than the immediate financial compensation. Veteran settlement programs were designed to help discharged soldiers establish themselves in civilian life and often involved the creation of entire communities populated primarily by military veterans. These veteran colonies, called colonia, were strategically located to serve Roman political and economic interests, while providing supportive communities where former soldiers could use their skills and experience productively. Family provisions for military families were limited compared to modern military benefits, but they did provide some protection for soldiers' dependents. Soldiers were allowed to marry during their service period, though their wives and children weren't eligible for the same benefits that were provided to the families of Roman citizens. The military provided some support for widows and orphans of soldiers who died in service, but this support was minimal and often insufficient to maintain families at even basic subsistence levels. Retirement benefits were calculated based on the soldier's length of service, rank achieved, and the military situation at the time of discharge. Soldiers who completed full terms of service under honorable conditions received the best benefits, while those who were discharged early due to injury or other circumstances might receive reduced compensation. The retirement system was designed to provide basic security for veterans, but it wasn't generous enough to support comfortable retirement without supplemental income from farming, business, or other activities. Regional variations and specializations within the Roman military system created different service experiences that could significantly affect individual soldiers' careers and opportunities for advancement. The Roman army wasn't a uniform organization. It included different types of units with varying equipment, training, and mission assignments that reflected the diverse military challenges facing the empire. Legion composition varied depending on the strategic requirements of different frontier regions and the types of enemies that Roman forces were likely to encounter. Legions stationed along the Germanic frontier were organized and equipped differently from those serving in desert regions of Africa or the mountainous terrain of Britain. These variations affected everything from individual soldier training to unit tactics and equipment specifications. Auxiliary units provided specialized military capabilities that complemented the heavy infantry focus of the traditional legions. Auxiliary cavalry units recruited from Germanic and Celtic tribes provided mobile capabilities that were essential for reconnaissance, pursuit, and battlefield flexibility. Auxiliary infantry units from mountainous regions were trained in specialized tactics that were effective in terrain where traditional legion formations couldn't be used effectively. Specialized military positions within the Roman army offered opportunities for soldiers who demonstrated particular talents or interests, though advancement to these positions required exceptional performance and often additional training. Engineers were responsible for construction projects, siege equipment, and technical aspects of military operations. Medical personnel provided healthcare services that were essential for maintaining unit strength and morale. Administrative specialists handled the complex paperwork and logistical coordination required to keep large military units functioning effectively. Provincial assignments could dramatically affect a soldier's experience during military service because different provinces offered varying levels of comfort, danger, and opportunity for advancement. Assignments in prosperous, peaceful provinces like Gaul or Spain might involve primarily garrison duties with relatively comfortable living conditions and opportunities for interaction with civilian populations. Assignments along active frontiers like the Rhine or Danube rivers involved constant combat readiness and frequent military operations against hostile enemies. The climate and geography of different provinces created varying challenges that required adaptation in equipment, tactics, and daily routine. Soldiers serving in Britain had to deal with constant rain and cold temperatures that required modifications to standard equipment and clothing. Soldiers in Middle Eastern provinces faced extreme heat and water scarcity that demanded different logistical arrangements and daily schedules. Mountain assignments required specialized equipment and techniques for operating in high-altitude conditions with limited supply access. Local political conditions in different provinces affected the military experience through their impact on relations with civilian populations, supply availability, and strategic priorities. Provinces with stable, cooperative local populations provided better logistical support and more comfortable living conditions for stationed troops. Provinces with hostile or unreliable local populations required constant security measures and created additional stress for soldiers who had to remain constantly alert for potential threats. Career advancement opportunities varied significantly between different types of units and provincial assignments. Prestigious legions stationed near Rome offered better opportunities for promotion and political connections that could benefit soldiers after their military service. Frontier units engaged in active combat provided opportunities to demonstrate valor and leadership that could lead to rapid promotion, but they also involved higher risks of injury or death that could end a soldier's career prematurely. The cultural diversity within the Roman military created both opportunities and challenges that would be completely foreign to modern military experience. Roman armies included soldiers from dozens of different ethnic groups, each with their own languages, customs, and military traditions. This diversity created a rich cultural environment that could be educational and broadening for individual soldiers, but it also created communication and coordination challenges that required careful management. Language barriers within Roman military units were overcome through the use of Latin as a common military language, but most soldiers spoke their native languages among themselves and maintained cultural practices from their home regions. This meant that Roman military camps were multicultural communities where soldiers were exposed to different foods, customs, religious practices, and worldviews that could significantly broaden their personal perspectives. Religious diversity within the Roman military reflected the variety of beliefs and practices found throughout the empire, and soldiers were generally allowed to maintain their traditional religious observances as long as they didn't interfere with military duties. However, certain religious practices that were seen as incompatible with military service were prohibited, and soldiers were expected to participate in official religious ceremonies that honored Roman gods and the imperial cult. After experiencing all of these challenges, the brutal recruitment process, the exhausting training, the harsh daily routine, the overwhelming equipment loads, the constant dangers of campaign life, the primitive medical care, the rigid discipline, and the cultural adjustments, it becomes clear why the average modern person wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion. We've become accustomed to comfort, convenience, individual rights, and technological advantages that would have been unimaginable to ancient Roman soldiers. The physical demands alone would overwhelm most contemporary people, but the psychological challenges would be even more difficult to overcome. Roman legionaries weren't just physically tough, they were products of a completely different culture that emphasized duty, sacrifice, and collective identity over individual comfort and personal fulfillment. The Roman military system succeeded because it took ordinary men and transformed them into professional soldiers through a combination of selection, training, discipline, and shared hardship that created unit cohesion and individual toughness that modern armies can barely achieve with all their technological advantages. Understanding the reality of Roman military life gives us perspective on both the achievements of ancient civilizations and the comfortable circumstances of modern life that we often take for granted. So the next time you're feeling frustrated with a difficult workout at the gym, complaining about your work schedule, or struggling with some minor inconvenience of modern life, remember the Roman legionaries who marched 25 miles in armor while carrying 90 pounds of equipment, then spent the evening building fortifications before getting a few hours of sleep on the ground in a crowded tent. Remember the men who learned to use weapons designed for killing, who lived for years away from their families in harsh conditions, and who faced the reality of hand-to-hand combat, knowing that their survival depended on their training, their courage, and their commitment to their fellow soldiers. They accomplished things that seem impossible by modern standards, not because they were different from us in any fundamental way, but because they lived in a world that demanded more from them and provided the systems necessary to meet those demands. The Roman military machine was an institution that took ordinary young men from farms and cities across the Mediterranean world and forged them into professional soldiers capable of conquering and holding an empire that stretched across 3 continents. This transformation wasn't achieved through magic or superior genetics. It was the result of systematic training, rigorous discipline, shared hardship, and a culture that valued collective achievement above individual comfort. The legacy of Roman military service extends far beyond the specific techniques of ancient warfare or the historical details of particular campaigns. It represents a model of human potential realized through dedication, sacrifice, and commitment to something larger than oneself. While we live in a world with different challenges and different values, we can still learn from the example of men who accomplished extraordinary things through ordinary virtues like courage, perseverance, discipline, and loyalty to their comrades. The Roman legions remind us that human beings are capable of adapting to almost any circumstance, overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles, and achieving goals that require sustained effort over many years. They show us that individual limitations can be overcome through systematic training, that personal fears can be conquered through group solidarity, and that great achievements require great sacrifices. Most importantly, they demonstrate that the comfortable circumstances of modern life, while representing genuine progress in human civilization, shouldn't make us forget the fundamental qualities of character that enabled our ancestors to build the foundations of the world we've inherited. In the end, whether you would have lasted a day in the Roman legion isn't really a question about physical toughness or mental resilience. It's a question about values, priorities, and what you're willing to sacrifice for something you believe in. The Roman soldiers we followed through this journey weren't superhuman. They were products of their time, shaped by their culture, and motivated by the opportunities and obligations that their society provided. Their story is ultimately our story too, because we're all heirs to the civilization they helped to create and defend. Understanding their experience helps us understand ourselves, our capabilities, and our responsibilities to the society we've inherited from them. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.